What's up guys, welcome back to Paul's Hardware. This is my second build for July 2019. I've done two builds this month, sort of to celebrate the launch of Ryzen 3000 series. Earlier in the month, I did sort of the top end build. It was almost $4,000 with the Ryzen 3900X 12-core processor. Today, I'm doing a much more reasonable build, something that you guys might be able to put together at home. If you put together these parts, and I'll put links down in the description, you're gonna be spending between $900 to $1,000, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on what you choose. I'm gonna go over all the parts that I've chosen. Then we're going to put this whole thing together. And today we are featuring the NZXT H510 Elite case, although if you look at the parts list in the description, I'm recommending the standard H510, which is a little bit more reasonably priced.
Excellent!
So let's start off with the CPU at the center of this build, which is the Ryzen 3600X, which is a 6-core 12-thread processor. This processor does boost up a little bit faster than the 3600, which costs $200 versus the 3600X, which is $250. And you do get a little bit beefier of an inbox cooler along with this one. You get the Wraith Spire rather than the Wraith Stealth. That said, for $250, you do have a second option here. Save $50 and just go with the Ryzen 5 3600. You still get 6 cores and 6 threads. Not as beefy of a cooler, and it's not going to run at quite the same frequency out of the box, but you could also, for $200 plus maybe 30 or 40 bucks for an aftermarket cooler, get a setup kind of like this. So if you're comfortable doing a little bit of overclocking, you're probably going to have a better setup with this kind of configuration. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be building with the 3600X today, but do keep in mind, you might want to consider a solution like this because you get a better cooler that's going to stay quieter overall, and you can probably get just about the same performance, maybe even just a little bit better. Second thing you're going to need for your Ryzen 3000 build is memory, and if you've looked at Ryzen at all in the past couple of years, you might be familiar with the fact that you do want faster memory for Ryzen in order to get the most performance out of it. This is a FlareX kit that was actually made for 1st and 2nd gen Ryzen. It's 3200 rated speed. If you look in the video description though, I have a 3600 speed kit listed there, and you can find 3600 speed 16 gig kits, 2x8 gigs, similar to this one, but just a bit faster for around $100 right now, even a little bit less if you don't care what it looks like. I'm mainly using this kit because it's a pretty simple design. It's just all black, and just to point out, you don't need fancy RGB or anything like that with your memory. Just make sure you get a kit that's 3600 speed or a little bit faster, and if you're concerned about compatibility at all, double check your chosen motherboard and see if they've tested that memory with 3rd gen Ryzen to confirm that it works. 3rd gen Ryzen should have much better memory support though than 1st or 2nd gen. Next is our motherboard, which is the MSI B450 Tomahawk, which I've used and recommended quite a few times. It's still a 400 series motherboard, so for a little over $100 you can get this motherboard. You can also overclock, you can also support an 8 or 12 core processor even, because it does have well-built power delivery. It doesn't have some of the higher end features that you get with more expensive motherboards, but functionally it will get you all the performance that you need. If you are considering a 5th gen motherboard like a X571, you're going to need to spend probably around $200 for that, whereas this one you can find for usually about $100, maybe $110. Our power supply today is the Cooler Master MWE Gold 650 watts. This is a little bit more expensive. It's available for about $80 right now. So again, in the description below, I've listed an 80 plus bronze rated power supply for around $50. You might need to look for a deal or a sale to get a 650 watt, 80 plus gold rated, fully modular power supply with all black cables, but you can usually find that for around 50 to 60 bucks. This I've seen on sale for that much, but check the video description if you want some other recommendations for power supplies that will be functionally equivalent to this one and might cost a few dollars less. For our graphics card, we're actually in a great situation when it comes to the mid-range of GPUs. If you're spending around $300 to $500, so many new choices right now. They're all really good performers. For today's build, I'm going with the AMD Radeon 5700, the non-XT, so you can get this for about $350. Feel free to consider spending about $50 more on the 5700 XT, or if you're a baller and you want to spend around $500 on a graphics card, I would recommend the RTX 2070 Super. You're going to need storage for your build, so for that I have this little 512 gig NVMe SSD. This is the SX8000 from the XPG series by ADATA. If you're looking at 500 gig class SSDs, you will find a fair amount of SATA SSDs around $45. I'd highly recommend checking in the $50 to $60 price range though, because you can find SSDs similar to this one. They're M.2 NVMe, not SATA. Do bear in mind you can find M.2 SATA SSDs. You want NVMe, and you can get read and write speeds upwards of 1500 to 2000 megabytes per second, whereas SATA SSDs will top out at about 500 to 600 megabytes per second reads and writes. So it's definitely worth your while to invest $5 or $10 more in an SSD like this. And again, I've linked some down in the description. Finally, we have the case, the NZXT H510 Elite. This is a follow-up to their very popular H500, and the base level H500 you can find for about $70. The base level H510 NZXT currently has listed for $80, so that's the price I'm listing for this particular build. The Elite actually costs $150, and it comes with some bonus RGB lighting, as well as a couple 140mm fans pre-installed in the front. If you're planning on buying the fans already, then it might be worth your while to invest $150 in this case, but definitely keep in mind that you can get the standard H510 for about $80, and that might be a better bet if you're trying to stay on budget. One last thing to mention before we get started building is potential incompatibility between the motherboard and the processor. Even though the motherboard might support this newer processor, if the motherboard is a 300 series or 400 series board that was manufactured 6 months or a year or 2 years ago, it might not have the updated UEFI BIOS in order to be compatible with these 3000 series CPUs. Depending on the motherboard, because some motherboards have update functions that work without a CPU installed, we might need to install a first or second gen Ryzen CPU into this motherboard, then update the BIOS, and then we can swap in our 3000 series processor. I will let you guys know in the follow-up testing video if that gives us any trouble and how it goes. For now, let's get started with the build. Here is the H510 Elite, and as you can see in the back here, we have this extra control unit that's attached. This is part of the H110 or H510i. So if you get the H510i, which I think is going to cost around $100, you'll get this in there, and you'll get some extra RGB lighting on the case. When it comes to the Elite, the 240mm pre-installed fans up there, I think, is the main additional thing you get with that. Now the side panel here is tempered glass. It does pop off like so. So it's got a couple little nubs here that hold it into the top, and then the bottom of it just kind of sits in a little groove there. The power supply basement down at the bottom is actually part of the side of the case too, so you got plenty of ventilation on top of that. These little holes actually double also as mounting points for the two 2.5-inch drive mounts that are at the back, so you can leave those installed there, or you can bring them up here and put them side by side, or rotate them, or install them however you want. So that's pretty convenient if you've got a 2.5-inch drive to install. You can kind of get a look at the removable radiator mount up there by the 240mm intake fans, the NZXT crossbar here that they have included. If you get one of the color versions of this case, this might be white or an accent color, so that makes it stand out a bit more. This is the more subtle all black version of the case, so that's why it's all black inside. You do get a rear 120mm exhaust fan. There is not a fan installed on the top, and if you've checked out the Hardware Canucks video on this case, you might have heard that installing an exhaust fan here at the top is actually pretty good for thermals, as is removing this front tempered glass piece. So if airflow is a consideration, you might want to hold off until they hopefully do a mesh front panel version of this, or something you can swap out there. That said, there is a decent amount of air intake on the side panel here, and that does have a filter on it. Not very easy to remove, but I think they just want you to remove the whole side panel if you want to clean that out. And then there is also a gap down here at the bottom for additional intake, and there's a removable air filter down there as well. Other than that, you have a dust filter down there for your power supply intake. You've got some groove channels here for routing your cables and doing cable management properly, as well as some pre-attached Velcro strips. And then there are a couple 3.5-inch drive mounts down here at the bottom where the accessories are tucked away. The complaint for this is that there's no drive caddies. Basically, you're going to need to remove this whole cage, install your drives in it, and then put the cage back in, rather than having sleds that pull out to install onto. So that's not the most convenient. Just make sure you plan ahead if you're installing 3.5-inch drives. Last thing to mention, your I/O and power on-off buttons is up here at the top. You get a single USB Type A port and a single USB Type C port, and then this port, which is actually both mic and headphone. So it's one of those combo jacks, and they give you a little splitter to plug into it. I never recommend using front panel headphone jacks anyway, so I'm not going to use this. All right, guys, at this point, the build is pretty much assembled. I wanted to say a few quick notes, just things that I have noticed as I've been assembling. First off, this USB 3.0, or I'm sorry, USB Type-C port up here is a 3.1 Gen 2 port, which means that it has the pass-through that plugs into the motherboard if you have that newer header. This motherboard does not have that newer header. That's one of the things you lose because it is a more budget entry-level motherboard. So not gonna be able to use that port with this build. Just something to keep in mind. You would need to upgrade the motherboard in order to take advantage of that. The USB 3.0 port does work, so you do get access to that. I do like that since you're paying a little bit more for this elite version of the H510, since it does come with those front fans, as well as this intelligent controller device, which handles both fan control as well as connecting up to LEDs. And that will also work with the NZXT cam software to help control and monitor that stuff. It was all pre-wired. So the two front fans were already plugged into that, as well as their LEDs. And then for this top LED, which is nicely recessed and also has a bit of covering once the side panel window goes onto it, that's also pre-wired, and they also have a pass-through coming off of it over here. Actually, I just tucked that away, so that's right there. So if you are gonna connect up more LEDs, you can just connect them up to that if you wanna do a full window wraparound or something like that. Just keep in mind, you'll want to get LED strips that are compatible with the NZXT stuff because they do have their own proprietary design for addressable LEDs. Beyond that, here's a quick look at my cable management. I spent a minimal amount of time on this, but I do want to point out that I do like and appreciate NZXT's work with these grooved channels with some of the Velcro straps, just for routing some of the cables in particular if you have a big thick 24 pin or something like that. But I was able to get it quite tidy in here so that I can put the side panel on, and then from the opposite side, everything should still look nice and pretty. And now the moment of truth. Power switch is on in the back. Power switch is working in the front. And that reminds me of the one other thing I wanted to mention about the front panel on this case. They have a block. They've actually been doing this for several generations now. They're repurposing a USB front panel connector, but that allows you to just plug in the front panel power, LEDs and everything all at once. And they do provide a little extension splitter for it. In case your motherboard doesn't line up with the pinouts on that little block, you can just use the little extension and then plug them in individually in the super annoying way that most people have to do it. That said, hey look, the system works. It's powered up, fans are spinning, we got LEDs. And I actually kind of like that the default NZXT has gone with is white, even though these are addressable RGB LEDs. And now, of course, we have a moment to peel off the protective plastic. And here it is, guys, the finished build, at least for now. I'm looking at this and thinking, dang, this looks really nice. There are just a few minor aesthetic quibbles that stand out to me. The standard 5700, for example, does not have a back plate, so that's standing out to me just a little bit. Doesn't look horrible by any means. It has a black PCB at least. Also, the NZXT H510 here on the side, since the tempered glass kind of tucks into this panel here, not quite as straight as I'd like it to be, fit and finish wise. Just a little bit under par when it comes to a case that might cost 150 bucks. If you're looking at the standard H510 for 70, 80 bucks, then maybe that's a little bit more acceptable to you. I think overall the system looks great though, but more to the point, I really like launches like we've had in this past month or so, because if you take a look at what you were able to build a couple months ago or last year for around $1,000, compare it to what you can build now for $1,000, it really tells the story, I think, a little bit of the progress of PC components just hopefully getting faster over time, hopefully not being sandbagged too much by companies that have a monopoly on a certain area of the market. And I think these recent launches from AMD have really provided some more competition that all of us should appreciate, whether you're going with an AMD build like this one or whether you're using NVIDIA and Intel. Thank you guys so much for watching this video though. My plan is to follow up with some testing on this system and the almost $4,000-ish build that I built earlier in the month. So stay tuned for that. Hit the thumbs up button on your way out if you enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys next time.